A while back, I took a creative writing class, and during one portion of that creative writing class, we went through personal essays. There's a specific essayist named Annie Dillard, and she had an essay called Seeing. And though there isn't something necessarily special about the writing of this essay, the idea is something that I find very important. So we're going to start with a very small piece of Annie Dillard's essay, Seeing. And if you ever want to check that essay out, you can, of course, Google Seeing by Annie Dillard. All right, here it is. The world is fairly studded and strewn with pennies cast broadside from a generous hand. But, and this is the point, who gets excited by a mere penny? If you follow one arrow, if you crouch motionless on a bank to watch a tremulous ripple thrill on the water, and are rewarded by the sight of a muskrat kit paddling from its den, will you count that sight a chip of copper only, and go on your rueful way? It is dire poverty indeed when a man is so malnourished and fatigued that he won't stoop to pick up a penny. And later she says, I used to be able to see flying insects in the air, but I lost interest, for I dropped the habit. Now I see birds. One collects stones, another watches clouds, the third collects drops of seawater, which he examines microscopically. Unfortunately, nature is very much, now you see it, now you don't. It is a matter of keeping my eyes open. My name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good. Welcome to How to Write Good, the writing podcast that is not about how to write. My name is Daniel Poppy, your host. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. If you haven't already, please follow How to Write Good on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you would like to stay up to date with both How to Write Good and everything I am working on, please sign up for my email list. You can find that at my website as well. Again, that's danielpoppy.com. One other thing that's going on with me is I'm putting out a serialized novel. I'm putting out one chapter a month, so the first chapter is out. The novel is called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. It's going to be in podcast form, and it's going to be in written form on my blog. You can find the podcast form on this podcast channel, but if you prefer to have it by itself, you can also find it on its own channel. So you can look it up, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. It is on iTunes, wherever podcasts are found. And I'm really excited about it. It's something that is just new. It's something creative that I have considered doing in the past, and it's just really cool to do it right now. Our word of the week is aberration. And if you don't know what that is already, it isn't a ghost. It is something that deviates from the norm, and it typically deviates temporarily. This is actually something that I used to not know the exact meaning of. My brother brought it up in a conversation. He's like, do you know what that means? Usually it's with statistics. If you have an outlier is typically an aberration, or you could use that word to describe it. It comes from, in the 1950s, it meant wandering, and the original word is abara, I believe, in Latin. It's from Latin. It means wandering. So the 1950s word did not deviate very much, which I think is a pretty cool thing, actually. So the word is aberration, and most people probably know it, but I just think it's something that's going to fit with our theme, our main topic today as well. All right, we are going to get into our accidental essence, and I'm going to sum it up right here, what we're talking about, and then we're going to be done. It's going to be a 16-second accidental essence, and that's it. So we are on rule number 11. Rule number 11. That's more for me than for you, because I have pretty much thought that this was rule number 10 for the past week when I was recording it, and I kept on writing 10. Rule number 11 is something that is good for all creative people. So if you're a creative person, you're listening to this, this is not just applicable to writing. This is applicable to what you're doing as well. Rule number 11 is collect pennies. If you are astute, you probably noticed that the beginning, we talked about Annie Dillard, and she was talking about pennies. And she was talking about how valuable pennies are to people and different things like that. So we are actually not going to talk about Annie Dillard yet. We're actually going to end with her, but first we're going to talk about some other stuff. We are going to be talking about Zen. We are going to be talking about Mark Twain. We are going to be talking about liminal space, liminality. I think that's a word. I made it up if it's not, and it should be a word. We are going to be also talking about cliches. And then we're going to talk about Annie Dillard and what she's talking about there. And why I think this is so important. And why this is a rule. Now, some of you may be saying, well, this isn't a writing rule. It isn't a writing rule, but it's something that is going to affect your writing in a lot of ways. And if you actually start to practice this, it's going to affect your creative writing. And I think you could even extend that to say that it's going to affect your other writing as well, but I don't want to make that claim. I don't want to be completely concrete. I don't want to I wouldn't die on that hill, okay? I wouldn't die on the hill that this is going to make your other writing phenomenal. But I think that there's an important aspect to writing that you can pull from this idea that she's talking about. But first, let's talk about Mark Twain. So if you know Mark Twain, for whatever reason, there was I think my brother was watching it because my brother is really into history. And I believe he was watching a documentary about Mark Twain, and it talked about his life. And for whatever reason, I remember this one quote he has about himself, that he calls himself an enormous noticer. Now, despite the fact that that's kind of a weird turn of phrase to us now, if you actually think about what that is, it means that he sees stuff that other people don't. And I've talked about in the past that a lot of creativity is about seeing what other people don't. So instead of focusing on the world and just moving through it and you just don't see certain things, you actually stop and you see things that other people don't. And I think that even the phraseology of saying that I am an enormous noticer is noticing something that other people don't. I actually think that's the case. So when you are looking at a specific idea, you can notice ideas that other people don't as well. For example, what Mark Twain did, or at least I think what Mark Twain did, is he looked at this situation. He saw that, okay, people notice things, people look at stuff, people like looking at the flowers. They see, oh, the sky, there's different shapes in the sky and the clouds and stuff like that. There's a man on the moon, or if you're in China, there's a rabbit on the moon and different things like that. But then he kind of took it a step farther. He's like, oh, well, did you ever notice that? Have you ever looked at the grains of sand? I'm assuming that he actually noticed these things if he assumed he was a big noticer. But then if you go even further, he might have said, okay, what is noticing? Like, what do people actually do? And he looked into that part. So just hold on to that thought. We're going to move on because this is going to move pretty quickly. So we have this idea of noticing by Mark Twain, and he was a big noticer. Another person who was a big noticer, and I brought this up, and I'm saying big because enormous is an odd word to use in front of noticer. But another person who noticed a lot of things and thought deeply about things, maybe that's what we should call it. Like, he thought deeply about things, and that's what Mark Twain was doing as well. And he was seeing things in the world that other people couldn't. And other people who did that was the guy who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I would suggest, if you want to kind of get a different perspective on the world, or a relaxing perspective on the world, I would suggest reading that book. Now, what he did, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he pretty much tells a story of his life, and he tells a story of him going on a trip with his son, and they take a motorcycle to go on the trip. And when they're on the trip, they have to do the maintenance on the motorcycle. And what he does is he says, instead of looking at things and getting frustrated because you're trying to work on this motorcycle and you keep on trying things, you allow yourself to focus on the motorcycle. You allow yourself to slow down, and you allow yourself to see what that motorcycle is. And I think this is kind of what Mark Twain was doing in the same way. He was slowing himself down. He was allowing himself to see, and he saw things that other people weren't able to see. I know that Arnold Schwarzenegger is into Zen, I believe. There's a specific type of Zen or meditation. I think it's like transcendental meditation. And I think how that works is where you focus on one specific thing and you almost imagine that you're inside that thing. And you become so focused on it that it kind of clears your head. Now, Zen is really not, it could be religious in the same way that mindfulness could be religious, but Zen is really this idea that you're focusing on something. It helps your concentration. So if you're someone who's like, well, I don't know about this, and if you're someone who's scatterbrained, probably like me, consider thinking about mindfulness, because what it does, it just slows you down. And it allows you to just focus on your mind, and then things come through your head, but they don't hijack you. I was actually just writing the second chapter of my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. If you want to get that, it's out. I mean, you can't get it. It's not out. It's out in a podcast form. It's in written form on my website, so check that out. But Nice plug right there, right? But what I'm writing in it is that anxiety, when you have anxiety, it takes control of your brain and you don't realize you have anxiety. But you can detach yourself from that if you become aware of it, and you can see that anxiety from the outside. You can be like, oh, this is what I'm going through. So that's kind of what's happening with mindfulness. You're seeing what you're going through. Instead of just allowing emotions or things going through your head to control you and jump from one to the other, you're actually experiencing something. So I would say that, think of it like this way. Anxiety is the opposite of mindfulness, and I would also add something else to that, saying that daydreaming is the opposite of mindfulness. Why would I add daydreaming to that? Because you kind of get carried along by your daydreams. Your daydreams shift you from one thing to the other, and you don't really notice it. Also, anger is the opposite of mindfulness because you're not taking yourself out of that situation. Any strong emotion where you get caught up in it and you can't reflect on it is the opposite of mindfulness, or that you won't reflect on it is the opposite of mindfulness. And that's what I think is happening with the Zen stuff. That's what I think is happening with Mark Twain. I think he detached himself from where he was and he looked at things from different perspectives and he saw things that other people didn't see. So I think that's what's going on there. Now, if you're someone who's into Zen or mindfulness or anything like that, I probably presented a really simplified version of it, but for the sake of what I'm talking about, I'm just going to present it like that. I know that some people would think, oh, there's this and this and this that goes with it. There's all that research. But I'm just trying to get across what this idea is, and I think there is a connection between the two. I think most people would say that as well. So we're going to talk about liminal space now, and then we're going to get into something really interesting, cliches, because I love cliches. So I really love cliches. So liminal space, if you haven't heard of that before, liminal means the space between or transitional periods. And there's this... So, for example, if you're in someplace new, or you're traveling in a car, or it's generally if you're experiencing something new and it's in flux. Like if things are in flux, if the world is open before you, if you're uncertain what's going to happen in the future, you're in like a liminal state. And there's a couple different responses you can have to a liminal state. You could be worried about it. You could respond emotionally to the liminal state. And I think you could respond not even necessarily being worried and anxious about the liminal state. I think you can respond to that liminal state in a way that is just filled with emotions. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about with mindfulness as well. So you could just be swept up in emotions. For example, I'm sure that getting married, like a wedding ceremony, is a liminal state for a lot of people. They're like, wow, this is crazy. And they're all swept up in their emotions and like, this is something completely different. And they're like, wow, like this is, you kind of feel out of body in it, but at the same time, I'm really happy. And then there's other things where people die and people worry and people are sad and they don't know what's going to happen. But, in some cases, people are very ingrained, stuck in their emotions, which it makes sense. People are emotional creatures. I think emotions do play a big part in us, and I don't necessarily think you should just say, oh, get rid of your emotions, think without your emotions. I think your emotions are, in a lot of cases, they are telling you the truth, if that makes sense. For example, if somebody punches you in the face and you get mad at them, it probably makes sense to get mad at them. If someone hurts your family member and you want to kill them, it may make sense to try to be angry at them, to be furious at them, to rage. If your family member dies, it makes sense to be hurt. Some people may say, well, it doesn't matter if he's going to die. We really don't matter at all. So what's the point of feeling those emotions? But I think that if you're not feeling emotions at all, well, you're probably a psychopath, a sociopath, whatever. And you're just taking a very core aspect of what humans are. I don't think you should be driven by your emotions, but I think that they are definitely a part of you and you shouldn't ignore them. And you should use them. You should use them and you should allow yourself to feel things. So there's that aspect of being in a liminal space where you're caught up in your emotions. And then there's the other aspect where you, like I said before, where you feel like it's an out-of-body experience. Where you go into this situation, you're like, wow, what's happening? This is really interesting. This is different. This kind of happened to me when I was traveling with a friend in Europe for a month. And in the U.S., where I live, because we're in the Midwest, we don't have trains. We don't have many trains. There's trains in Chicago, but I don't live in Chicago. But So we don't have trains, so we don't travel on trains very often. And going on trains was a new experience for me because I'm like, oh, how does this work? How does this work? How does this work? There was this flux. I didn't know how it was going to work. I didn't know what was going to happen. And especially when we first landed, we were in an airport that was connected to a train station, or it had trains connecting it to it, I guess. And we're like, what the heck is going on? Everybody's speaking a different language. Everybody in Europe speaks English. Let's be honest about this. But everybody was speaking a different language. We didn't know what was going on, and we weren't worried. We're just like floating. We're just super tired. We're like, all right, what should we do? Let's get on a train, etc. But we also ended up in a situation that was also just a different state, a transitional, because train platforms are a transitional period, and we ended up actually staying on one overnight. So we actually ended up I didn't sleep. I don't know if my friend did either. We ended up just staying and pretending that we were sleeping on this train platform, and there were other people there as well. And that was an interesting and bizarre experience because the train platform we slept on was huge, or at least I remember it being fairly large. And there were a lot of people there as well. But I don't know, I think that's why people get obsessed with traveling, this idea of liminal space, because they walk into this space that they're not used to, and everything is a novelty. When you run into a novelty, your brain, there's a chemical in your brain that spikes. There's endorphins in your brain that spike. Endorphins that spike if you run into something novel. And I think that's what's happening with these people who get addicted to travel. They like run into it and they're like, oh, like there's something new, there's something else new, and they keep on going and they keep on traveling because they love it so much, because they thrive off of that newness that's coming with it. And there's a certain level of anxiety that's good in a person. Anxiety raises in a person, and it can push you forward, and it can actually feel like excitement in a way. So for me, if I drink enough coffee, I get really, really anxious, but at the same time, it propels me forward because I have a lot of energy. The reverse of that is I don't drink any coffee and I'm really, really tired, or I stay up all night. There's a high level of probably, I think you call it cortisol. It's an anxiety chemical in your brain, I believe. I think it's cortisol. And that goes up when you're anxious or you're stressed out. But when I don't get enough sleep, I kind of meander through life in this punch-drunk kind of way. And I do stuff that I wouldn't otherwise, and I have that same thrill, but I'm very worried when I have that same thrill. So when you are in a liminal space, it's a lot easier to see things, going back to that beginning part with Annie Dillard and that personal essay, right? But we are going to actually, before we get back to Annie Dillard, like I told you, we are actually going to be talking about cliches. Because most people hate cliches, but I think cliches are really, really important. And actually, I'm a little worried because I think I say the word wrong. So when I grew up, I always heard cliche, but it has an I in it. And I before I recorded this, and I should have looked up how to say the word, and maybe it's both. But recently I said cliche. So we're going to use that word. And if you think it's wrong and you say cliche, I have no idea. Honestly, I doubt everything I've ever said. I have no idea what I'm talking about. It could be completely different. So cliches are things that we use over and over again. Typically, they're phrases we use over and over and over again, and they just become redundant, and it kind of shows that someone isn't thinking about what they're saying. They're just kind of saying something to fill the space. This happens with writers a lot. They add a cliche in, and it's like, well, yeah, we don't even know what that means because the cliche doesn't mean anything anymore because it's been used so much. Have you ever noticed that? If you have something that's used so much, eventually it just loses its meaning. It gets watered down. This happens with movies. I talked about movies a couple weeks ago. I think this is one of the reasons why, and I didn't really talk about this necessarily, this idea, but this is probably one of the reasons why we don't like remakes as much, or stuff that it has sequel upon sequel upon sequel. So if there's like a billion things that are created related to this one thing and it's not original, or these things are not original, or they don't have as much creative punch to them, we think we don't like them as much because they become cliche. My favorite cliche is beating a dead horse. All right, that's just beating a dead horse. Or you could have, there's another cliche we have is feeding two birds with one, or killing two birds with one stone. I know there was that issue in the news recently where PETA wanted to change specific cliches. They wanted to say feeding two birds with one stone. But I think that the killing two birds with one stone is much more satisfying cliche to use, honestly. And besides the fact that, like, it's a cliche, who cares if it gets changed, you know? People don't like them in the first place. Most people don't like them. I love them. I love them so much. Okay, so you might be thinking why I love cliches. What happens in writing is most authors and most places you go where you say, oh, what should I avoid in my writing? And most people would say, this is what you should avoid and this is what you should do. Most of the time, people are telling you to avoid cliches. And I'm actually doing the exact opposite. I want you to embrace cliches. I want you to look at cliches and I want you to say, hey, that's useful. Because I think I've gotten to the rule where I said that every tool is useful, but not every tool is as useful. And cliches are one of those tools that are extremely useful. But you might be thinking, why? Why are cliches extremely useful? Why are you telling me this? Because every other person that I run into or so many other people say that you shouldn't use cliches in your writing. Well, there's a reason why those things are cliches, right? There's a reason why they are cliches. At one point in time, someone saw something in the world. They noticed something, if we're going to go back to that, right? And they said, I'm going to compare this to this, and then I'm going to make a point with it. So what happened is there was a dude. This story is completely false. There was a dude, and he had a mother, because all dudes have mothers, and he had a girlfriend, because that happens sometimes as well, too. It happened more in the past than it does today, because people don't actually have girlfriends. And that dude was getting pretty close to the point where he was like, I'm going to ask this girl to marry me, because people actually did that in the past as well. Also, if you have a girlfriend and you aren't married to her and you're at that point where you're like, I'm either living with her or going to marry her, just marry her because it's better. That's my word of advice today. So what he did is his mother was like, hey, when are you going to marry her? And then the next week she's like, when are you going to marry her? And it kept on going on for 2 months. And eventually he saw some dude on the street and he was trying to get his horse to move. But his horse was in pretty bad shape and the horse was old, so he kept on hitting that horse and eventually the horse fell down. And then he ran up to the dude and the dude kept on hitting that horse and he's like, dude, you're beating a dead horse. He said that specifically. Exactly. He said, dude, you're beating a dead horse. And he's like, that's exactly what my mother's doing. She's beating a dead horse. Because you know what? If you beat a dead horse, it's not going to help It's not going to help anyone. It's not going to help anything. That's why it is a good cliche. Now, should you use cliches in your writing? That's the question. And you shouldn't. You shouldn't. That's my answer. You should not, or you should try not to, unless it's dialogue or it just flows unbelievably well. Always go with the flow. Always trust your ear and develop your ear. It's kind of like music. Develop your ear for music. Develop your ear for creating music. In the same way, you've got to develop your ear for writing. You should use cliches. Now I'm back to cliche. That's how I grew up hearing it. I don't know. You should use cliches in your writing, but you should look at the cliche and you should think about it. And you should think about where that idea came from. And you should find the essence, the kernel of that idea and why that idea is so satisfying. And then you should rewrite it. You shouldn't just try to rephrase the cliche. You should try to find the deepest part of that cliche. And you should say, what does this mean? And why does it mean this way? What's the modern analog? And you should just mull over that. You should ruminate on that cliche for about 2 weeks, more, I don't know, whatever. A little bit of time. Take some time, just let yourself think about it. And you don't have to say, I don't have anything to say about this. Just go back to the cliche that you were going to use and just allow yourself to think about the cliche. And eventually you're going to get down to that story I told you, and there's going to be a story like that every single time. So for the killing two birds with one stone, that was actually me who came up with that cliche, and I was actually out throwing some rocks in the air, and I used to hunt for birds, and I threw one, and I'm like, wow, I killed two with one hit. In the same way there's been snipers in wars who've killed multiple people with one bullet. So you could say, killing 5 men with one bullet, but that's a lot more morbid than killing 2 birds with one stone. But it gets the point across. It's really hard to do that. And if you can do it, it's just a bonus because you get more food, right? If you don't eat meat, you're probably going to die young. But if you don't eat meat, then you don't think that's useful because you're not going to eat the meat. But back then, being able to kill 2 birds with one stone was awesome because it's like, wow, we've got 2 servings. We've got 2 servings. And if those 2 birds were turkeys, you got food for 3 months. It's amazing. So when you engage with cliches, don't just push them to the side being like, this is a cliche. Bring them in, be like, hey, you're my pal, you're getting kind of old, you're getting kind of worn out, but I want to get to know you really, really well, and get to know that cliche really well. And eventually you'll be like, hey, I understand what you are, and I understand what you mean, and I understand how I can use you in my writing. Don't just put the exact phraseology of that cliche down. Change that cliche. Find out what it means. Connect it to your own writing. Connect it to your world. Connect it to your experiences. And you're going to have writing that's going to be better. Now, you're probably wondering, when I was going through Mark Twain and when I was going through Zen and when I was going through liminal experiences, you may have understood how that connected to Annie Dillard's essay on seeing. You probably are wondering how the heck cliches connect to Annie Dillard's essay on seeing. But first, we got to talk a little bit about Annie Dillard's essay on seeing, right? So Annie Dillard's essay on seeing is essentially this idea that there's billions, an infinite number of things in the world that are like little pennies. When she was a kid, at the beginning of that essay, she talks about how she used to hide pennies for people. And she's like, oh, there's a surprise ahead. And she'd draw arrows toward tree trunks or wherever it was hidden. She's like, money ahead, money inside, whatever. Because she wanted people to find that surprise and find joy at finding that small little copper penny. And she takes that idea from her childhood and she expands it to the real world. She expands it to reality itself. So instead of just looking for pennies, actual pennies, you're looking for the little things in existence that make existence beautiful, that they're now you see it, now you don't, kind of how she said. So what she says in the middle of that part that I read, she said, but, and this is the point, who gets excited by a mere penny? And I think that's a really interesting thing, because what she's saying is that there's all these little tiny bits and pieces in the world that are built into the world that we can enjoy, but people don't get excited about them. And I think that people should. I really think that people should. I wouldn't say it's not immoral not to get excited about it, but I certainly think that if you do get excited about these little bits and pieces in the world, that you're going to be a lot happier than if you didn't. You get excited about these little pennies. And then also she says, oh, how bad it is that a person can be so malnourished and they can be in such a bad state that they are too poor to actually pick up a penny. And she's talking about the person's mind, right? She's not talking about the fact that the person is actually poor and malnourished. She's actually talking about the fact that the person hasn't cultivated their mind enough to actually notice these beautiful things in the world. And I think that as someone creative, you've got to notice these things in the world. And I think that Mark Twain did it. I think that he noticed things other people didn't. And I think that the guy who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, I'm not going to get his name right now, he also did it. I think he did it as well. He slowed down enough to appreciate these beautiful things. And Annie Dillard is taking it a step further. She's saying not only can you just slow down and see these things, but you've got to be aware of it all the time. So I used to be in practice. I am not as much, and I certainly want to be, and I always continue to try to be. I used to keep a notebook of ideas around, like things I see in the world that I think are cool. And I would see something and I write it down because I didn't want to forget it. That's a little treasure that you find, just like Annie Dillard, the essayist, talks about. It's a treasure, and it's something that you see, but it's something that you can't really hold on to. It's something that goes away so quickly. And her prescription for doing this is a matter of keeping your eyes open. What she specifically says, it is a matter of keeping my eyes open, referring to herself. Now, you're probably wondering how cliches connect to this, and then after I talk about cliches, it's a prescription for you, essentially, that I'm going to give it at the end, that you should collect pennies. So, and why you should exactly collect pennies. So, cliches are examples of people who have collected a penny they found in the world. Maybe they've found about 15 of them. Right? It's not necessarily the case that they've found one idea or one cool thing or one beautiful thing in the world. They found 15 and they've connected them together. Or maybe they found 2 or 7 or whatever it is. They found a little collection of things in the world and they've connected them together and they've seen, oh wow, that's just like this. And they wanted to, and it wasn't even a physical thing necessarily. They saw something physical. They maybe saw somebody beating a dead horse, and maybe they saw someone killing 2 birds with one stone, or maybe they saw someone who wanted to keep their cake. Like maybe they saw a child and they saw a kid who really liked the cake they got, because have your cake and eat it too means you can actually keep your cake in its whole entire form, and eat it at the same time, but that's impossible. So maybe they saw a child who wanted to keep that cake perfect, but they also wanted to eat the cake, so they had a fit, because really small children have fits over anything. And they're like, wow, that really connects to this different idea. And they saw some other idea in the world, and they were able to connect those two things. They were able to connect the concrete to the abstract, and they were able to bring better clarity onto something. And that's where we get the cliche, because people realize, they're like, wow, you're really right. Like, if somebody goes on about something, or someone keeps on talking, or someone keeps on going on and on like I am, and they beat a dead horse about something, then it is like you're beating a dead horse, because it's really pointless. It's not going to help at all, and you've already drove the point home, and it's this really visceral image if you really think about it. And that's why it sticks in your mind, and that's why if you actually think of what it is, it makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot more satisfying of an image. I mean, a dead horse being beat isn't a satisfying image, but it is something that sticks with you. So that's what cliches are. And that's why I think they're important, because you don't have to do all the work of seeing something. You can do the work you can take somebody else's work and what they've written, and you can kind of unpack that, and you can work with that. That's why it's good to read in general. I would say that you should read if you're going to write. And one of the reasons is people always have different experiences than you. And you're going to be able to use those experiences, use those turns of phrase with your own stuff. But every time somebody writes something, so you don't want to go into a situation as a writer or a creative person and mimic somebody else's stuff, right? You don't want to make something that is a copycat. You don't want to plagiarize. You don't want to be a poser, as it were. I don't know if you'd use that in that way. You want to make something new. But what you can do is you can look at somebody's stuff and you can get inspired by that. And that's what you should do with cliches. Instead of just taking cliches and plagiarizing cliches onto your page, because that's kind of what you're doing, because somebody already used those exact words, use that cliche for inspiration. Also, instead of just going through your life and taking other people's ideas, open your eyes. Make sure you're seeing stuff. Keep your eyes open, as Annie Dillard says, and make sure you're looking for all the little things. And I would actually suggest, and I think this is going to help your writing, I would suggest keeping a list, a notebook full of ideas, full of things you see. Now, some of you may say, well, this will give me ideas for my writing, so that's good. But I think this will give me things to put in my writing. For example, if you see something in the world, or you have this specific experience. Like, for example, if you're in the rain and you get stuck in the rain and you have to walk through the rain, and you're with a really good friend and you have a really good time, that is a very specific experience, and it's probably a good experience that both of you hate. Like, you're miserable, but you love the experience at the same time because you're experiencing it with somebody you like. Well, you write that experience down, and it gives you fodder for later on. But what I think writing that experience down does as well is allows you to process through it. And a lot of writing is processing. I think some people don't realize this, but the more you're able to think outside of your own writing, the easier it is to do the writing itself. So when maybe some of you who are also experienced from writer's block can do this as well. You take an idea that you're thinking about, you don't know how to start, and you just allow your mind to process that. You allow it to, decompose in your mind, essentially. And then you can take it and you can spit it out more easily later. But I think a lot of people think that they can just spit it out. And this is what happens with people. This is how a lot of writers work, not all of them. And I'll tell you why I work a specific way as well. They write their first draft without any planning. And they write their first draft, and essentially it's just them processing through what they want to write. It's just them processing through the story, and then they go through their drafts and they smooth it out. So they kind of are doing all the thinking while they're writing, which is a really big mental load, which you already know that I plan out all my books and plan out all my stories ahead of time. So if you are a creative person in general, and I think this is even applicable to non-creative people, but I think this is essential to creativity, look for those things. Keep your eyes open. Keep your eyes in that state where things are new. Like that liminal experience, what that is like something new is around the bend. So instead of getting swept up in your emotions, step back from it and being like, what's going on here? What am I doing? What can I use in this space? And in some cases, you just have to relax to get there. But I think it's going to be really beneficial. Our logical fallacy of the week is called argument from fallacy. Let me make sure that's correct. Yep, argument from fallacy, otherwise known as the fallacy, which I think is pretty amazing. So argument from fallacy means that someone is arguing and then they have fallacies within their arguments, and someone says, oh, they have fallacies within their arguments, therefore they must be incorrect. But that's not actually how it works. So you may be thinking, but if they have fallacies within their arguments, they must be incorrect because they're not thinking well. Well, think of it like this. If you've ever been in a classroom or you've ever dealt with a kid under the age of 12 who's doing math, or a kid who's 14 and doing math and doesn't know what the heck they're doing, aka me, if you have a kid like that, they do this math problem and they end up with the correct answer. And you look at what they're doing and you're like, this isn't how you do it at all. This is never going to work. But they end up with the correct answer anyways. So just because someone has a fallacy in their argument doesn't mean the conclusion they're drawing is false. It just means how they're getting there is incorrect, which isn't a good thing, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. So you really have to look at it from all sides. So it really gets complex, and it just makes you think more about, okay, even though they have this in here, we just have to think about that. Again, that is argument from fallacy, or my favorite way to say it, the fallacy fallacy. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support me more, what I would ask you to do is that you go to iTunes and you leave a 5-star review. That is something that really, really helps me and helps push the podcast out to different people. And it's something that doesn't cost you much time at all. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. If you ever listen to this podcast and you have questions or you have topics you would like me to cover, you can send those to me and I'll look them over and I'll see which ones I think I can cover intelligently. And if you just want to reach out for anything at all, you can do that as well. Thanks for your time. My name is Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.